you, David.
Okay. So this seminar has actually arisen out of a book that the International Society for Horticultural Science is putting together, looking at the global footprints of walnuts. And as I said the other day on the radio, I was lucky. I got invited to do the chapter on Australia, which has just over 200 years of history. Someone else has been invited to do the chapter on China that has 10,000 years of history to look out and sort out the walnut systems in. And Australia has a production base of one major producer that produces about 80% of it, and totalling in about 3,000 odd hectares. The Chinese have tens of thousands of growers, now up around 2 million hectares of walnuts planted. So I lucked out in terms of what I have to do. But I came at this thinking it would be a pretty dry sort of a topic, that people eat walnuts and they grow walnuts and there's really nothing much happens. Somebody sticks a tree in the ground and a few more trees get stuck in the ground and that's it. I was actually quite surprised as I dealt through this just how much walnuts have interacted with our history and been involved and reflected the change in our culture, and in some instances actually led the change in our culture over the last 225 years. So I actually got a bit more excited about it as I got into it. Just before I get started, I'll just give you a quick rundown on what walnuts are. And as everyone can see on this, that gives you a full explanation of walnuts and where they're grown and where they're arose, so I don't need to talk about that at all, because it's all there. But China actually has these large native walnut forests that then go across into the neighbouring republics and into the Caucasus and Persia and so on. So they cover a huge area originally. And this is a picture that I took looking through a walnut tree across to the Great Wall of China, which is, I thought was a nice little picture. And we need something like that from Australia, but I'm not quite sure what you'd look at the walnut tree at, but it must be something. So walnut production's been expanding massively in recent years. You can see here production, I've got to put my glasses on, I can see too. You can see production has gone up considerably just since 2007 up to 2011. Huge rise in production. You're looking at exports totaling about that's actually $750 million annually. It's a huge crop globally, exporting rapidly. Countries like China, between 1997 and 2007, have over more than doubled their production, and they've in fact now tripled it again since 2007. So China now has close to 2 million hectares of walnut trees planted. They have a huge area planted. So there's been this huge expansion in walnut production. When we look at Australian horticultural crops, just as an overall, fruit and nuts, pretty big, $3.5 billion in Australian production. In 2011, 12, 13, Australian walnut production was about 12. So it's not a huge proportion of our production at present, but it's in an extraordinarily rapid growth phase at the present time, and we'll look at some of that later on. So it is still a relatively small crop, worth tens of millions of dollars, but very rapidly expanding within Australia. So that's where the global situation sits. Now you've got two views here of Sydney Cove, which sort of suggest that there has been some shift in the Australian culture and economy and everything in 200 years. So this is exactly the same view. That's a view looking down here, in Sydney Cove here, when the first flag was put up. So there has been some change. So as you might expect, there's been some change in walnut systems and so on. I'm talking about the colonial period and onwards from Australia. There were obviously people here for 20, 40 odd thousand, and some estimates now go up to 60,000 years prior to the colonial period. And we do know that the Aboriginal Australians had contact with Macassans and Chinese and some European prior to the first fleet arriving, but there's no evidence whatsoever that any walnut species, any Juglandaceae species, was ever introduced to Australia prior to that colonial introduction. There's no evidence whatever of any prior introduction, even though it would have been possible. So there are no native Juglandaceae in Australia. That is what Walnuts is part of. But there are an enormous number of references to walnuts in Australia, and they're references to a number of laurels which confuse everything, particularly when you start looking at old literature from Queensland. They're forever talking about walnut trees, but they don't mean walnuts, they mean these laurels. And these are they have two things. One is fruit that look very similar to black walnut fruit, and wood that has a lot of very similar properties to walnut wood properties. So if you go to the Australian Herbaria, there's 4,000 entries that talk about walnut. Of all entries that talk about walnut, actually only 45 of them are entries relevant to Juglandaceae genuine walnuts. All the others are to these other trees which produce a fruit on the outside that looks like walnuts. Internally it's completely different, and some of them are extraordinarily poisonous, so I wouldn't recommend you get too involved in taking them. And if you look here, that's Juglans nigra, or black walnut from the United States. Persian walnut's the normal walnut that we produce, and they're wood. And just here was those previous pictures, and you can see this does look very similar sort of fruit, very similar size as well to black walnuts. And the wood actually looks quite similar as well and has very similar properties. So if you're looking up the history of walnuts in Australia, you've got to spend a lot of time pulling out all these references to walnut that are not walnut at all. And just for those who want to leave early, the potted history of walnuts in Australia is they were brought in by descendants of UK descendants, and they were treated like they would treat walnuts in the United Kingdom. And then after World War II, Germans, European immigrants came in, a few different changes came. Then we had our post-1970 globalisation. There's a whole lot of changes in the way we use walnuts. As we've become more global, we've gone into producing more walnuts along global lines, and we've exported from local imports to exports, and we now produce Chinese type systems. And this was the oldest picture of a walnut tree you can see here, which is just outside of Adelaide in 1913. And these were the people who used to grow walnuts, big families on their family orchards and so on, as happened. So if anyone wants to leave now, that's in a nutshell what I'm going to talk about, and I'll just get started to talk about it. Now, walnuts came to Australia, I believe, on the first fleet. What I can find is a reference from Banks, who set up the requirements for all of the crops that should be on the first fleet and taken to Australia, requiring that walnuts were on board in his reference list. What I can't find is proof that those walnuts actually survived the voyage and were planted straight away in Sydney Cove. But since everything else was on it and there's no reference saying that they didn't survive, almost certainly there were walnuts definitely on the first fleet, and it's very likely that they would have brought nuts and some trees, and that those would have survived and been available from the very first in Sydney Cove. And when you start to look at the other settlements in Tasmania, the settlement started 1803. By 1818, walnuts were flourishing in newspaper articles, and the Chief Magistrate of Tasmania had a highly productive tree producing a vast quantity of walnuts in 1823, sitting pretty much where Spotlight is now, and that's the oldest identified location I can find for a specific walnut tree. So if it was flourishing in 1823, it would have been planted in about 1810, somewhere around there, within half a dozen years of the colony starting, and was flourishing and producing vast quantities of walnuts there. So it's probably the oldest specific reference to a very particular site, so we can locate exactly where that tree was just on 200 years ago. Queensland and the Northern Territory tropical areas probably don't grow very much in the way, and have never grown much in the way of walnuts, but are forever trying to confuse you by telling you how much walnuts they're growing, but they're not walnuts at all, they're laurels. Western Australia, the colony started 1827. By 1833, trees were thriving, so they were planted right at the start of the colony if they were thriving 6 years after the colony. And in fact, the South Australian colony, founded in 1836, actually had local nuts available in the market in 1839. So there must have been some early settlers there actually planted trees prior to the start of the colony. So walnuts were something that was very important to the early settlers. Everywhere they went, they took them and they planted them as soon as they possibly could. So it was a very major component of the colonies. Now, they actually got involved in all sorts of issues as well. So there are a lot of discussions about how much duty you should pay to bring things into the colony, and a major argument about walnuts that eventually was settled that you only pay 3 shillings per hundredweight duty on walnuts because they came in their shell, whereas you had to pay 6 shillings duty on almonds because they generally came shelled when you imported them into the country. So there are a lot of discussions mentioning walnuts when they look at tariffs, colony to colony tariffs in the early days of the different colonies in Australia. So walnuts were actually part of all of these discussions around tariffs against duty setting. But it's quite difficult to be certain whether they were exported from colony to colony. The first evidence for that comes from a loading docket that I've found, which is in the library here, which says Swansea was loading walnuts for export in 1889. Probably destined for Melbourne, but it's a bit unclear. They're also advertised quite widely in the paper, walnuts for seed, pickled walnuts, and by 1823, J. Tarwell, an apothecary in Sydney, was advertising walnuts, pickled walnuts, walnuts for purgatives, walnuts for medicinal purposes, walnuts for consumption, a whole different range of walnut uses by 1823. They're coming in from Europe. They'd come in bags, and they'd come either alone or with almonds, and they were coming from Chile. So you're getting Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere imports in different seasons of the year. So they're fairly important. In October 1828, there are 1,040 pounds imported. If you annualise that, and other months had the same sorts of levels, you're probably looking at about 140 grams per capita per year in the colonies was being consumed. In 1891 in Victoria, they had 39,000 pounds imported, which is only 15 grams. So if they're actually consuming 140 grams per capita, the vast majority of walnuts at this stage were being produced locally for local consumption. And some of the orchards that were doing that in Victoria actually still exist today. Rather decrepit and run-down trees, but certainly existing. And walnut trees were advertised in all of the early Victorian tree catalogues. So there's a lot of interest by all of these early colonial settlers in walnuts as a product. Now, those of you who think a little bit about inflation, between 1828 and 1842 there was huge inflation. Walnuts went up from 4p a pound to about 8p a pound. If you go from 1842 to 1913, walnuts slowly went down from about 8p a pound to 7p a pound, so you had almost 100 years there where the price of walnuts stayed exactly the same. The interesting thing, if you go 100 years from 1913, the price of walnuts has now increased by 100-fold. Huge difference in inflation over those two different 100-year periods. And you can actually see this dip here is probably associated with, as you're all aware, of the recession and depression in Australia in the 1890s. So during that period, walnuts dropped by about 40-odd% in price associated with the recession in Australia. So all of these sorts of issues are coming out. Walnuts are reflecting the recession. They're showing the stability of the currency for 100 years, and then our modern trend towards generating inflation. And I don't expect you to read all of this, but the idea was walnuts had a whole lot of uses. They were used for making hair tonics. The oil was used for a hair tonic. They would process them, and I thought this was quite good. One prepared walnut is a dose for a child of 6 as a purgative. Preparation, I'm not quite sure what preparation was, but I think it was various soaking and pickling things, and they'd give them the whole walnut. And the kid, at the end of it, would have the necessary effects taking place on them. So walnuts may not have been highly desired by children at that stage, I guess. But they also used them for as something to eat after you had onions. At the end of the meal you would eat walnuts, and supposedly this would freshen your breath. And if you readers of Tennyson, his poem about Across the Walnuts and the Wine, the discussion after dinner when the women got sent away to various places and the men would sit down and eat walnuts and drink wine and solve the problems of the world. And it was interesting when they recaptured some absconding convicts around the time that this poem was written. The judge said they were captured in a hotel drinking wine, and he wondered whether they were also eating walnuts and living a life of Riley while they'd absconded from their official duties, which would have been back-breaking labour, smashing rocks. So he seemed to think that these convicts were having a life at that stage which was pretty good. It's interesting, walnuts were consumed in the theatre, and there's one article talking about how the young women sat in the theatre cracking walnuts with their teeth. I don't know that I'd recommend that to anyone, but apparently they did this, and that was the theatre critics' feeling was that was the most interesting part of this particular play, was watching the young women eating walnuts. One would assume that either the women were extremely attractive or the play was pretty bad. I'm not sure which he was referring to. There's also been walnuts found in the space between the walls in some of these 1850s buildings, indicating that the labourers making the houses would be eating walnuts and chucking them into the cavity space in the wall while they were doing their work. And when they come back and repair the walls later, they find these walnuts. So there's a lot of interesting things happening. Here in Hobart, during this time, the walnut orchards tended to be orchards with a range of different trees and fruit trees in them. And if you go wandering around Hobart down to, this one's at Nutgrove and this is out at Newtown, you'll find remnants of these orchards, very old walnut trees. Now, this one's not an old walnut tree, but 3 years ago there used to be a dying walnut tree there. There were 3 of them, and the council has come back and replanted them with 3 new young walnut trees. But out at Newtown, this is in someone's backyard, and if you look at the surrounding backyards, someone else has got an almond tree, someone else has got an apple tree. So a little orchard has been split up from there, and all these houses have been built, and you've got these walnut trees. So if you actually go wandering around Hobart, particularly out towards Newtown, South Hobart, down around Nutgrove, you'll see these trees and little groups of trees which are the remnants of old orchards. This is the oldest photographed walnut tree I can find, which is in Victoria, which was planted in 1850 and is part of a small orchard from that time as well. So this was that first major period from the colonies period. Walnuts involved in a whole lot of different things, relatively small orchards, but apparently meeting most of the demands of the colonies in terms of walnuts. Mostly non-grafted trees and not particularly of interest. But from Federation to more recent times, there's been a bit of a shift. So between 1830 and 1890, in the newspapers there are about 2,000 news articles a year mentioned walnuts. Between 1890 and 1950, went up to 6,500. So there's a huge expansion in the number of articles about walnuts, a lot of it about timber uses and so on. The state agricultural research stations all got going and started to publish the occasional articles, so there's a little bit of research going on. The state agencies were starting to recommend varieties. Franket, Wilson's Wonder and Mayette started to be recommended. And then in 1920, the first genuine commercial orchard of about 3,000 trees was planted at Gapstead. And that orchard still exists today, and up until about 1990 it was still the largest walnut orchard in Australia, at which stage it had expanded because they'd planted another 5,000 trees, or two brothers had planted locally, so there was quite a large trees. But it was all based on Californian technology, so there'd been a shift. Prior to these orchards, all the technology had come out of Europe. But post this, it was all started to be based on Californian technology, Californian varieties and Californian knowledge. And you continued to grow a bit. And these orchards now went from these half dozen to 30 trees, as I say, up to orchards of thousands of trees. And they started to do a little bit of processing and harvesting and do grafting, and in the time start to bring in mechanisation and so on. So a slow expansion. If you look at the recipes, walnuts, this comes out of the Australian Woman Weekly, walnut recipes were pretty common, so you had 3,300 of them compared to 17 pine nuts. But in the early part and the late part of the 1900s, it didn't make a lot of difference. Walnuts were about as common, walnut articles were about as common early and late. But we did start to bring in some of these strange and exotic things into articles. So the Women's Weekly was starting to write recipes for Brazil nuts and hazelnuts and this strange commodity called rice, which hadn't been around before. All of these started to come in, but walnuts still had their British tradition up until about 1980 or so. But from about 1975 on, things changed drastically in Australia. Instead of having European and British migrants, we started to get migrants from all over the world, and people started not to have meat and three veg, but started to have a great variety. So if you look at this 150 odd years in recipe books produced at the time, walnuts averaged about 0.5% of the recipes contained walnuts. Very few of them actually got above 1%. But in this period where we started to get Chinese migrants and Asian migrants, Middle East migrants, people from all over the place, all of a sudden Australian cookery books have quadrupled the number of walnut recipes. So our whole cooking has changed in this period, and it's reflected in just looking at how common were walnuts as an ingredient in all of these different things. So they're actually reflecting here the major shift in Australia as we went from a European society to a multicultural society. We went from cookbooks which barely mentioned walnuts to cookbooks that had loads of them, and it just seemed a very strange and interesting phenomenon that was so easily shown. In the very recent past, walnuts have now started to explode in terms of what's taking place. In 1990, the Walnut Industry Association was formed. Victoria appointed a walnut officer in Harold Adam. Major trials were set up. we in UTAS became the leader for other nuts and National Horticulture Research Network. In 2009 we had the International Walnut Symposium, the first time it's been in the Southern Hemisphere. And this walnut development started by VCon in Tasmania, starting to set up major plantings, which are now run by Walnuts Australia from a subsidiary of Webster's. And then they planted another 1,700 odd hectares in the Riverina, and we've now got processing facilities in Violet Town in Victoria, new ones about to be set up in the Riverina, and Walnuts Australia was the Austrade Exporter Award. So just in the last 20 odd years there's been this huge expansion in walnuts, and a huge interest in Australia and in global recognition, for instance through the 6th Walnut Symposium. And there we are, there's me sitting at this symposium. The book is, we've edited the book and published all of these results, and Lee Titmus there is managing something like almost 3,000 hectares of walnuts in Australia now. So walnuts have become a big issue. Kathy Evans from here with Harold Adam with the Walnut Industry Association has set up a whole of industry growth and production and research plan, so the industry is now looking in that way. And I'll just show two tables here. Between 1973 and 2010, walnut imports went from 600 tonnes shelled to 4,500. This is before the big Australian production came on. This is getting back now to almost zero since that date because of the massive increase in Australian production. What happened though in that same period is we simply stopped importing walnuts in shell, down from 800 tonnes to 67 tonnes. What happened was people got really lazy, and globally the best walnut you can eat is a fresh walnut out of the shell, because immediately you take a walnut out of the shell and break it, it starts to go rancid. And my own opinion is once it's been out of the shell, exposed to the air for more than 2 or 3 months, it has lost most of its top quality characteristics. However, we and other countries as well, the United Kingdom and various places, have decided it's better to eat rancid walnuts than crack open the shell, because that's such a lot of hard work. So we now import all our walnuts shelled, and we eat all our walnuts rancid, and they all have this lovely bite of rancid oil that gives you a really strong flavour associated with rancid oil. And in fact, studies that I did in the UK, people think rancid oil taste is the actual flavour component of walnuts, and wonder when they get a fresh walnut why it doesn't have a walnut flavour. But we went away from in-shell to shelled imports. Considerable amount of research started to get done. This was some research done here in Tasmania looking at walnut blight, which is a major disease. So really shifted towards doing good, top quality, world recognised research on walnuts here. This is also financial stuff. This is some price versus quality, and you can see that these ones up here are very low quality. The high number indicates very poor quality, and they tend to be cheaper. But since people don't really recognise in the main what a quality walnut is, there's not a really strong relationship between price and quality. So many of the walnuts that are quite high priced actually have poor quality, but there is some relationship there. And as I say, this major production, so this is the walnut orchard up in Riverina, processing facilities, all starting to develop this major industry in Australia. And remember that very first table I showed you, about $10 million worth of walnuts value. The estimate by 2020 is we should be at about $68 million worth of walnuts produced per year. So that, and right now we're sitting here probably $20 to $30 million. So we've gone in a period of 3 or 4 years from almost nothing to about 30 million, and with what's planted already, our expectation is we'll hit 68 odd million by 2020. So walnuts have actually become a major industry here, not up to Chinese standards. We need to increase somewhat considerably. It was interesting travelling through China. I actually saw one location where a single farm had 2 million grafted walnuts on it ready to sell that next year. So there were going to be 2 million plants come off that one farm for planting. So the Chinese don't necessarily do things in a small way. Walnuts are also being used for specialist uses, timber, and in 1873 the South Australian subsidy for good, usable and valuable timber planting included walnuts. You're allowed to get your subsidy off the government for planting walnut trees at that stage, though there's only about 120 hectares of black walnut planted in Australia. But there were some pianos manufactured in Melbourne around 1900, and one of these, which is sitting here, is now on display in the New South Wales Government House, New South Wales. This piano here is made in 1900 from walnuts in Australia. What I can't prove is whether the walnut timber was imported or locally grown. Could have been locally grown, but it is one of very few references to walnut timber that actually means walnuts in Australia. They also have non-food uses, mulches and fillers, and those of you who keep iguanas or lizards will know that walnut mulch is one of the best things for mulching the bottom of your lizard cage. So they have specialist uses. And the oil, though once again, country walnut oil in Australia is actually from candle nut, not from walnut, and most walnut oil produced prior to the last few years out of Australia was actually referring to this candle nut walnut oil, not proper walnut oil. So it would be really helpful if instead of reusing the same names and words, we would come up with different words for different things. But we seem to like to reuse words. They do have some ornamental value, however. They're not seen very often as an ornamental tree. There's only one of 680 odd memorial avenues in Australia. There's only one of them contains walnuts, and this one's just out of Ballarat in Victoria. The oldest tree I can definitely prove in Tasmania is this one at Runnymede, which was planted in 1870, and just down at Newtown. People know where Runnymede is. So this is the oldest one, though there are references to some existing trees that were planted in 1833 up at Swansea, but I haven't been able to actually locate them and prove whether that's true or not. If they are, they'll be the oldest known walnut trees still existing in Australia. So they do have some ornamental uses, but not all that much. Partly because they tend to get pretty scrappy looking in winter, and they don't look very nice when they get droughted. They lose all their leaves and look fairly scrappy. So just to give you an overall quick snapshot of 225 years of history, walnuts came out on the first fleet. They weren't here before then. They expanded all through the colonies. The colonists like walnut trees. They like to bring them with them and plant them and have walnuts around. They were involved in all sorts of important things in Australia, in theatre critiques. They were also part of some search and seizure laws in Tasmania, where somebody went onto someone's property looking for stolen walnut trees without any warrant, and the police got into trouble, and there was major discussions about the rights to do this. They've been part of the expanding agricultural base of Australia as we've shifted away from just wool and wheat. They've become part of that. They've been an important part of discussions around tariffs and state-to-state tariffs and setting up that and international tariffs. And they have reflected the change in Australia from this British use to a multicultural use as we've come through the last 200 years. So they've actually, from what I thought was going to be a pretty dry topic when I started, and which you may still think is a pretty dry topic, they've actually had a major involvement twisting in and out of Australian history for 200 years, which surprised me and I found quite interesting. And it might be interesting for other people to have a look at some of the crops and things that they're dealing with and see whether they also have a bit of an exciting history over the last 200 years. And not just look at the science of what you do, but look at the culture of it as well.